Hello students, I will just quickly go through the other three theories of taxation, and then we will move on to see what you mean by the incidence and the incidence of taxation, okay, and impact and incidence of taxation, okay. So the seventh principle or theory is the equity principle or theory. And in this equity, what does it mean? So you might have seen almost all these terms are very familiar to you. So equity, now many theories you have seen equity principle is touched upon. So equity means what? Equity means fairness and justice in the distribution of the burden of taxation. So and I'm sure what you mean by distribution of the burden of taxation. So it's not the amount of money that is collected is important, but the distribution of the burden, that is more important while imposing taxes, okay. So equity means what? Fairness and justice in the distribution of burden of taxation. So what does it mean? It means that the burden of tax is spread more or less uniformly on equity basis among the taxpayers. So the two implications of these equity principles are horizontal equity. So you have already seen that, right? And the ability to pay theory you have seen. So what is horizontal equity? Equals should be treated equally, and vertical equity means unequals must be treated unequally. There is no problem in understanding this, right? So the eighth point is least aggregate sacrifice principle or theory. Least aggregate sacrifice. You see, again all these terms are connected. You say equity principle, it is something, it is that has a positive looking into the positive aspect. Here it is looking into the negative impact of taxation. See, so ultimately least aggregate sacrifice means it should be more justifiable, more equitable, right? That's the meaning of that. So this least aggregate sacrifice principle is supported by well-known economists like Edgeworth, Pigou, Dalton, and Cannon. Okay, so Edwin Cannon. It is a so according to them, the least aggregate sacrifice is the final principle of taxation. It is the final principle of taxation. And so what does it mean? Taxes should be allocated in such a manner that sacrifices incurred by persons paying taxes taken together would be the least. See, so taxes should be allocated how? In such a manner that sacrifices incurred by persons because of the paying taxes, that has to be taken together. So when it is taken together, it would be the least. That's why it is known as least aggregate sacrifice. So you total out all the sacrifices incurred by all the persons due to taxation, and that aggregate sacrifice would be the least, and that is the principle of least aggregate sacrifice. And the last one is principle of neutrality, that means having no definite characteristics, okay. So according to this principle, tax should be levied on different persons in such a way that the economic position of the taxpayer remains neutral and inequality of income is not affected. You see, this is something different, right? So according to this principle, tax should be levied on different persons or people in such a way that economic position of the taxpayer remains neutral. So what should remain neutral? The economic position. Neutral means it's no that there is no change between after the imposition of tax and also before the imposition of tax. The situation must be the same. So the economic position of the taxpayer remains neutral, and the inequality of income is not affected. Okay, so that's the meaning of principle of neutrality. So according to Professor A.C. Pigou, the function of the state is to realize tax and remain neutral towards reducing inequalities of income. So it is a Pigouvian view that the function of the state is to realize tax, right, and remain neutral towards reducing inequalities of income. He has called this principle of neutrality as leave them as you found them. So since the objective of society is to just to collect or realize a tax, or just to collect revenue from the public, so they should be neutral towards reducing the inequalities of income. So leave them as you found them. This principle suggests that including the principles of equal sacrifice, proportional sacrifice, and minimum sacrifice. This principle suggests including the principles of equal sacrifice, proportional sacrifice, and minimum sacrifice. So this is also they suggest. Okay. Then the demerits means it will increase the sacrifice of both the poor and the rich, adversely affect the economic welfare of the society. Okay. Okay, students. So we have discussed about 9 theories of taxation, and you have seen where the basis of canons of taxation is found, and on the basis of that how government can take decision, etc. And now we are going to see another important portion, that is known as the impact, shifting, and incidence of taxes. What is that? Impact, shifting, and incidence of taxes. So what are these three terms means? Okay, so I invite you to the PPT I have presented, I have taught, I have exhibited while I was teaching you the classification of taxes, right? So when it comes to direct taxes, you might have seen a picture where the taxes fall on the shoulders of a person, direct tax, and then his back is bent, right? His back is bent. What does it mean? That he feels so much of burden and he is not able to shift that burden to others. He has to bear the entire tax burden. So that is the case of direct taxation, right? So we say impact and incidence are on the same person. So impact means the initial burden of tax, and incidence means the ultimate burden of tax. So when in this case, in the case of direct taxes, it falls on the individuals, and no shifting of tax burden is possible. So that no shifting is there, so that the impact and the incidence of taxes are on the same person. Okay. Now, so burden of taxes does not always lie on the person whom it is collected. So in many cases it may be borne by the same persons on whom it is imposed, and thus he hand over the tax to the concerned taxing authority. Now you remember another picture which I showed you, what is the indirect taxation. So it is actually tax is imposed on the producers here, and what does it feel? That he feels a tax burden, and he stands straight, and then he just pass on the tax burden to the consumers. Okay, so there is a shifting is possible. So in the case of indirect taxation, there is a shifting of tax burden onto the consumers. So impact is on the one person, that is the initial tax burden, but the ultimate tax burden is on another person, that is on the consumers. So this is a case of all the indirect taxation, especially now all the indirect taxes are subsumed under GST, goods and service tax. So so GST is an indirect taxes. So what does it mean? That the taxes on all goods and services are indirect taxes, and in the case of indirect taxes, the tax burden is felt more the poor than the rich, because it falls on the initial burden is on the producer, but the producer shift the entire burden or some of the burden to the consumer, so that incidence, that is the ultimate burden of tax, rests on on others. Okay, so that is the case of indirect taxes. That's what the whole meaning of what is explained here. But there are a number of cases when tax is imposed on one person and borne by another persons partially or wholly. So hence it is essential to know who bears the immediate burden of tax and who bears the ultimate burden of tax. So immediate burden or initial burden of tax, or who bears the ultimate burden of tax. So in the process of taxing, three concepts are involved. Which are they? First one is tax may be imposed on some persons. Secondly, it may be transferred, that is shifted by him partially or wholly to another person or person. So shifting comes there. And then thirdly, it may be ultimately borne by the same persons or the second persons, or transferred to others. Okay. So in this way, the three words are used in the process of taxation, that is impact, shifting, and incidence. So what do you mean by shifting of tax? The tax may be paid by the person on whom it is imposed, or may be shifted to another person. the process of shifting the or transferring the burden of tax from one person to another is known, is unknown, no, is known as not unknown, it is known as the shifting of tax. Okay, so what is it? The process of transferring burden of tax from one person to another is known as shifting of tax. So whenever there is a shifting of tax, a tax can be shifted backward and forward. Okay, so there's a backward shifting and also there's a forward shifting. So what do you mean by forward shifting? Forward shifting means the burden of tax, the shifting means shifting the burden of tax by adding the amount of tax to the price of the commodity. So forward means you are forwarding that tax burden in the form of the price of the commodity, so it falls on the consumers. Okay, so മുൻപോട്ട് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ it will be on the consumers. So burden, shifting the burden of tax by adding the amount of tax to the price of the commodity. So he may sell it to another person and so on, and until tax liability of sellers, tax liability sellers on the ultimate okay, rest upon on the ultimate buyer or the consumer, or tax liability rest I don't know how so much of mistakes are there, how it came. Tax liability rest on the ultimate buyer or the consumer. Okay, so that's about the forward shifting. So this is the most common forms of shifting. So forward shifting, always remember, it is on to the consumers. So through adding the amount of tax to the price of the commodity. On the contrary, what is backward shifting? So back, what happens in the back means there is the entire production is happening, right? So backward shifting is something related to what is happening during the time of production itself. Okay, so on the contrary, backward shifting refers to the recovery of the amount from the suppliers of the factors of production by reducing their prices, so that is called, so how they are recovering the tax amount from the suppliers of the factors of production by reducing their prices. For example, when wages of workers are reduced by full or part of the amount of tax by the producer, it is a case of backward shifting. So you have learned now what is shifting, and also what is two types of shifting. Forward shifting, that is to the consumers, and backward shifting, shifting the tax burden onto the suppliers of the factors of production by reducing their prices. Understand? So next comes the incidence of tax or taxation. So as I have already told you, it is the incidence of taxation is the burden of paying tax, burden of paying tax ultimately. Okay, when the money burden of a tax finally rest, I think it is rest only, finally settles. So finally settles, not sells, settles or comes to rest, finally settles or comes to rest on the ultimate taxpayer, it is called incidence of a tax. So incidence of taxation is the burden of paying tax ultimately. When the money burden of a tax finally settles on or comes to rest on the ultimate taxpayer, it is called the incidence of tax. So finally it is related to who is bearing the ultimate tax burden. It is paid by somebody else, but then the burden is felt by someone else. The incidence of tax remains upon those persons who cannot shift its burden to any other persons. So who ultimately bears it? So in the case of incidence of tax, it remains on the same person or remains upon those persons who cannot shift its burden to any other person, so or artist who ultimately bears it. Okay. Now next is the burden of tax falls either on the buyer or on the sellers. If the price of the commodity rises by the full amount of the tax, the incidence is wholly on the buyer. Okay. On the contrary, if the price of the commodity does not rise at all, the incidence is wholly on the seller. In cases prices rise by less than the full amount of a tax, the incidence is partly on the buyer and partly on the seller. These are I hope you understood that. And then you come to the again incidence of tax. Okay, again repetition only. So what is the importance of incidence of tax? So taxes are imposed not only to get income to the government. This is the secondary objective. Primary objective is to levying tax is the equitable distribution of the burden of taxes among the different groups of the society. So it should be kept in mind that the burden of taxation should not fall on the poor. So tax should be paid according to the ability to pay. So the government has to see why we are discussing the incidence of tax. So the government has to see whenever government imposes a tax, it rests on whom or who bears ultimately the tax burden. So in the case of an indirect taxation or any commodity taxation, so whenever government imposes a tax, government should know that there's every possibility for the producer to shift the tax burden onto the consumer. So the government has to decide or take the preventive steps against this, and otherwise the entire tax burden will fall on the poor. So that is the importance of, in order to see that that's the importance of incidence of tax. Okay. So as I told you, the impact is the initial burden of the tax, which I have already discussed in the first thing we discussed on for whom it is for in the first, that is the initial burden of the tax. Okay. So students, I wind up here. I hope you understood what it is.